Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday's edition of Weekend Waypoints, production of SEC Extra and D1Baseball.com. Joe Healy here to preview Friday's action around the SEC, get you ready for a big day of baseball around the conference. As we always do on these Friday episodes, I'll start off with a little bit of a news roundup, get you caught up on some of the things that have happened during the week. If you had kind of checked out during the week, some results in the midweek, some injury stuff, unfortunately, some rotation news, all of that kind of stuff to get you ready for the weekend. As always, I just compiled this list as things kind of came along. So if it seems in a strange order, that's why. I appreciate you bearing with me on that. Ike Irish, unfortunately, going to be out for some period of time for Auburn. That's the word from Butch Thompson. If you missed it, it was in game 2 of the doubleheader. Auburn played against Mississippi State last Sunday. He was trying to beat out a slow roller, and just one of those things where your competitive nature kind of overrules your logical brain, and he slid feet first into first base, not even head first, feet first, and it was a late decision, so it looked like he kind of jammed his ankle into the base. It was Butch Thompson said, he's going to be out for some time. We don't know if it's 1, 2, 3 weeks, whatever it is, but he's going to be out for some time. I assume that means at least this weekend. We'll see what it means moving forward. I suspect if Auburn continues to drop games and is in a situation where even getting to Hoover looks like a remote possibility, that the more losses Auburn compiles over the next couple weeks, the less likely it is that Ike Irish returns. We will obviously have to see how that plays out, because without him in the lineup, I mean, that's a big loss. Auburn has a lot of guys who can hit, but none better than Ike Irish. So big loss there. A few Vanderbilt pieces of news on the mound. Devin Fitrell is back. He pitched in the midweek, so doesn't factor in for this weekend, but does make it to where Vanderbilt has another option in the rotation as the season goes on, if they feel confident putting him back in the rotation. Also gives them a little more depth. Sawyer Hawks is going to start throwing this week. Apparently, it's been a while since he's been on the mound. Don't forget, he was thought to be one of the best, pitchers in the transfer portal in the offseason. Was kind of thinking that he might be the closer for Vanderbilt when it was all said and done. He didn't get off to a good start and then went down with injury, and we haven't seen him in a while. So maybe this will give him an opportunity for a little bit of a reset down the stretch. Ethan McIlvain dealing with some soreness. That is obviously not good for Vanderbilt. He'd started to really come on. He thought, okay, hey, this is a freshman who's starting to figure it out. Things are on the upswing. At least I started to expect that he would end up having a big role as the season went on and we get closer to the postseason. But as of now, dealing with some soreness. There was no real update on him earlier in the week. And all of those Vanderbilt updates via Aria Gerson, our friend from the Tennessean, who was on Highway to Hoover earlier this season, shows a fantastic job kind of being the unofficial injury update getter on the Vanderbilt beat. So we appreciate her work there, because as you guys probably know as fans following it, I certainly know as a media member, sometimes getting injury information out there in the public sphere is like pulling teeth. So appreciate Aria's work to get some straight answers on some of that stuff. In the midweek, Georgia, 15-inning win over Clemson. And don't look now, Georgia's got a top 10 RPI. It is 9 as we sit here right now. They have a big opportunity this weekend against Texas A&M. Now, they're playing at Texas A&M, so that's also a big opportunity to get swept, right? Like that's all certainly on the table. But even if Georgia just gets a game this weekend, their RPI is not going to hurt from that. That'll be a quality win. And I bring all that up, the RPI stuff, to say that the race is on for Georgia. If they can get to 16 wins with a top 10 RPI, like, they're going to host. You will never go broke betting on the committee to lean on RPI above all else. We've seen it time and time again. Every year there are 1 or 2 outliers you can point to every year that don't necessarily hew to the RPI, but 99% of the time it's RPI first and foremost, it feels like. So that's big for Georgia. So the RPI is going to be there if they can just get enough SEC wins to get to that kind of imaginary barrier of 15 if you play well in Hoover, 16 even if you don't. Take last year's Kentucky, for example. Top 10 RPI, maybe top 5 at the time of Selection Monday, but I don't really remember. But certainly top 10 RPI, went 0-1 in Hoover, and then still hosted as the 12 overall seed. So that's kind of a little bit of a blueprint for the kind of thing Georgia's trying to do this season. Certainly that win over Clemson will get them a little bit closer. Good pitching effort for Georgia. That's kind of you wouldn't think they'd necessarily be equipped to win a 15-inning game against a good team like Clemson because of some of the questions on the mound, but that group did a really nice job. Speaking of midweek games, SEC went undefeated on Tuesday. That's the first time this season, according to Mark Etheridge and what he wrote on our site about the midweek. 12-0 on Tuesday for the SEC. The first time the league has gone totally undefeated in midweek contests. And that's, they may not have ever gone undefeated this season, but one of the things that has put the SEC in position to do what it has largely always done certainly the last 5 to 7 years, but really last decade plus. And that's, have the most NCAA tournament teams, the most hosts, the most top eights, and perhaps in the end, the most Omaha teams, is they just take care of business against the teams they're supposed to beat. Even the teams that aren't particularly good within the confines of the SEC tend to take care of their midweek games. And that's tends to get overlooked, generally speaking, when we're talking resume, but it is avoiding the losses more so than collecting those wins is a big deal. Florida's rotation, interesting. They're going Pierce Coppola, TBA, and then Cags, which is kind of the final form of what Florida has kind of been this season, which is, okay, we know we're going to start Cags on Sunday, and, he's been pretty good at times, certainly hasn't he has some of the same issues he had last year, but he looks like a slightly more refined version of what he was. And then the rest is kind of been a big question mark. And Pierce Coppola has gotten some starts, and I could be, this is just my take on it, but it feels a little bit like that's not so much because they think Pierce Coppola is an answer right now to the rotation issues. However, he is a starter. He's a future starter in pro ball. They see him as a starter. So I think that's more about, hey, we want to make sure we continue to get him innings and get him stretched out. Let's just start him so he can start with clean innings and then go from there. And we get what we get from him. So I suspect that's kind of what that's more about, more so than like, hey, is this guy a silver bullet for our rotation? Could be wrong on that, but that's kind of where I see it. Injury stuff for LSU. Brady Neal was available to hit in the midweek game. This is per Koki Riley of The Advocate. He was available to hit. He's playing catch. The issue is his throwing shoulder. So it's just a matter of, I guess that means he could theoretically DH. But as far as catching goes, they're waiting on his throwing shoulder to come around there. So that's something to watch there. For LSU, just a note, Tommy White hit a home run off someone's head. A fan named Corey sitting in the left field bleachers at Alec Box got hit in the noggin. Seemed to be all right. He gave kind of a funny interview about the situation. And Jay Johnson made a good point in postgame on Tuesday that, hey, look, if we go on and I'm paraphrasing, but if we go on a run here, like this is going to be one of those things that we point to as like just a funny, quirky thing that happened that started our rally. And, who knows if that'll happen or not, but he is right about that. If LSU gets hot the rest of the way and makes it to the postseason, does whatever, it does feel like that's going to be one of those moments we look back on, and whether it had anything to do with it or not, because it's just a silly thing, but that's kind of what college baseball is about, is embracing some of the silly and ridiculous and what have you. But glad that fan was okay, because honestly, getting hit in the head by a kind of a line drive home run by Tommy White does not sound pleasant in the slightest. And just, if you've seen the video, just misjudged it. Had his glove on, had his glove up, and it just hit him right in the head. So so there's that. For South Carolina, Will Tippett is out at shortstop. They're turning over shortstop to Lee Ellis, a very athletic freshman who's kind of an exciting player for the future. We'll see what he has in the present in the absence of Will Tippett. Mark Kingston also, in his media availability early this week, I read this from Alan Cole of Gamecock Central, that his quote is, "You might see some things this week you haven't seen all year." Some things this weekend, I should say, you haven't seen all year. I don't know what that means. Maybe it's just players in different spots, pitchers in different roles. I'm not really sure, but I'm kind of interested to see what that means. They're playing Kentucky this weekend. It's a big opportunity for South Carolina to get a much-needed series win against one of these upper echelon SEC teams. They've done a pretty good job taking care of business against the teams you would expect them to handle. And then they obviously did a nice job against Vanderbilt, a team that's kind of in their same place in the pecking order, but they've yet to really break through and get that marquee series win. And certainly against Kentucky at home this weekend feels like that opportunity. And speaking of South Carolina, Roman Kimball will be in the rotation this weekend. A little bit of a thumb issue last weekend, but Mark Kingston gave him the good to go. Guys who won't be in the rotation this weekend, Mason Molina for Arkansas, ankle issue, according to Matt Jones of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, Whole Hog Sports, but is expected back next week. So no Molina this weekend, so there is a TBA that day, but expected back next week. So maybe just kind of a little precautionary thing for Arkansas, being a little extra careful. Certainly can't hurt when you consider that Arkansas is in really good shape postseason-wise, and honestly, this Arkansas season is much more about June than it is about late April and May. So, they're obviously looking to get him in the best shape possible for the postseason. A couple of comments here. Jeremy Scott on Facebook, Roll Tide, as he always chips in here with. Finally won an SEC road game. That's true. The Tide with, we'll talk about it here in a minute, but the Tide with a blowout SEC road win. And then Armstrong Grappling on YouTube, LSU fan. Joe, I worry about weather. I'll put this on the screen here. I worry about weather being a factor in LSU series going forward. As it is, they need 14 wins, maybe 13. If a game gets canceled, they would lose a chance at a precious win. Yes, agreed. You are at a point of the season for LSU where the number of wins is probably the most SEC wins is probably the most important metric here. So I would expect, especially a coach like Jay Johnson, who's always, just hyper fixated on details and, what his team needs to do to get to here. Like, I promise you, there's no coach in the country that does more just gaming things out and thinking big picture and what have you. I suspect, regardless of what the weather is, and I haven't taken a long look at what the weather looks like in Baton Rouge, so I'll plead ignorance there, but I'll take your word for it. I suspect that even if it means a first pitch someday at like 11 o'clock at night, I suspect that we'll see the games get played. They'll figure out a way to get the games played, especially with the series being in Baton Rouge. Obviously, the coaches have to agree on any sort of setup, but typically being at home makes life a little bit easier for you because you are ostensibly in charge of the field maintenance and making sure that everything is in place to run the game. Whereas if you're on the road, you're a little bit at the mercy of the other university. And if the other university isn't motivated to get all the games in, and I should say there's no reason for Auburn not to, right? Because Auburn is ostensibly trying to get to Hoover. And so they kind of need the wins too, frankly. So I think they'll be motivated to get these wins in. And again, having the games in Baton Rouge, I think helps because Jay is going to be motivated to get them played, and they're going to do what they need to do to make sure they do get played. So I understand your concern. I would be surprised if they don't, unless we're talking about hurricane force winds or something. But again, I'll plead ignorance on that. But if it means moving the games to the Superdome, like I have a feeling that the LSU is going to try to find a way to get these games in. All right, let's talk a little bit about Thursday's games that we already saw. I alluded to this one just a minute ago, and our friend Jeremy mentioned it. Bama 12, Ole Miss nothing in Oxford. That's the other part of this. It's kind of surprising. Great outing for Greg Ferrone, 7-inning complete game because it was a mercy game, 12-0 after 7. Just exactly what Alabama needed when you consider that they really haven't gotten a lot of deep starts with all some of the injuries they've had. The fact that Ben Hess has not been that effective in SEC play, the number of times they've gotten a starter deep into a game, much less to finish one. That's few and far between. So that's big just on its face. You also save the entirety of the bullpen for the next 2 games. And given that you feel confident that the offense will be able to score some runs against this Ole Miss pitching staff that has not been particularly strong this year, you do feel like you're in a good position if you're Alabama to do enough offensively, and then your bullpen or the pitching staff in general, but especially your bullpen doesn't have to be too fine. They don't have to do too much, right, to get these wins. So that's big there. For Ole Miss, Hunter Simmons left the game before throwing a pitch with an apparent elbow injury. MRI is coming on that. I am not there, obviously, so I cannot say, but looking at the timelines of folks like Chase Parham, who cover that team day to day, it didn't sound like a lot of optimism coming out of there with that. So we'll have to see, but obviously that would hurt. I mean, they just got JT Quinn back, so it would hurt to lose a guy like Hunter Simmons, who is also, by the way, a quarterback on the football team. So there's also the football element of this. Like if it's a throwing arm thing, like, will he be ready for fall camp, right? Like so there is a kind of a knock-on effect of this. But from a baseball standpoint, it is a loss for an Ole Miss team that needs bullpen pieces. And then just generally not a good start to the weekend for Ole Miss, right? This is a big weekend for them. I think we've kind of circled a little bit that Ole Miss LSU series to end the season as, hey, that might be for which of these teams goes to Hoover with a chance to play their way onto the good side of the bubble. And maybe it still will, but man, if you're Ole Miss, you really got to play a lot better this weekend. This is really not a series you can feel like you can drop and feel good about things if you're Ole Miss, and that was not a great start last night. Also, Tennessee 10, Mizzou 1. Mizzou avoids the run rule there just narrowly. 6 home runs for Tennessee. 2 of them were from Billy Amick. Christian Moore led off the game with a home run. It was just kind of a comprehensive win for Tennessee, never really in doubt. AJ Causey pitched great again. They went with an opener, Chris Stamos again. Now, you remember last week against Kentucky, he pitched to, I think, 3 batters before they lifted him, and Causey came on. Went a lot better this time. You got him into the 3rd inning as an opener, and then Causey came on and was awesome. And I assumed last weekend when Causey pitched so well against Kentucky that, okay, next week Causey will be in the rotation and they'll kind of end this opener thing. But now it kind of feels like they're committed enough to this that maybe this is just what they do from this point forward. It's Stamos, Causey piggyback situation. And look, even last week when they lost the Friday game, it's not because they didn't pitch well enough. Generally speaking, I mean, they did a nice job against Kentucky and they lost a close game. Like that's just going to happen. So you could even argue it worked okay last weekend, but the last 2 or 3 last weeks, it's worked really well. So there should be some optimism about the way AJ Causey has pitched after he had a few rough starts there in a row in SEC play. But just like I said, a comprehensive win for Tennessee. This is obviously a bad matchup for Mizzou. It's on the road against a team that really can hammer the ball, and Mizzou's pitching staff is not really meant to miss bats or dazzle anybody. And so it's a lot of contact, and that's fine at Taylor Stadium in Columbia. It's less fine in Knoxville. Mizzou started Ryan McDeish, who is their best arm. It's a good arm, but just didn't handle a start very, very well. Tennessee kind of ambushed him, and that was that. So that's it for Thursday's games. Let's get back to some comments here. I see I've got some on X, we got the comment, Ole Miss trash. Not that surprising. I mean, sure. Yeah, they're not playing well. That's for certain. And then he comments again, Christian Moore, SEC player of the year if Condon catches mono. I mean, that's fair. Like, or whatever would happen to Condon. Yeah. Christian Moore has kind of elbowed his way. Christian Moore has kind of elbowed his way into being in that player of the year conversation. Jack Caglione is also in that conversation. He's picked up the pace home run wise to kind of put himself in the conversation with this. So I would say those 3, unless I'm just blatantly missing someone here. But, Condon and Caglione and Christian Moore right now feel like the guys that are leading that race. Ace Man on YouTube, Texas A&M series win over Bama looks a lot better now after what Bama did yesterday. Yeah. And then he mentions Condon, Montgomery, and Laviolette. Yeah, Montgomery's in particular a good one. Laviolette, the batting average hovering around 300, and I'm not big on using batting average as a metric, but it does tend to be looked at as like, hey, you got to be hitting, 343, whatever it is. So Laviolette may not get there, but maybe he will. But Montgomery certainly, the type of year he's having, he is in that conversation. But I agree. Bama's a good team. They just kind of, it felt like they had a couple of weekends where, what they were dealing with, the Riley Quick injury, the Hagen Banks injury, Ben Hess not being particularly good. Like there were just some weekends where that was too much for them. But I think if they're healthy, and they're not, but they're dealing with it as best they can. But when they're not actively losing guys in a weekend, they play really, really well. So I think Alabama's actually a good team whose record doesn't quite reflect what they are, but I think they're playing better now. And I think they'd have to really hustle to host. That's not likely, but they're going to be a nightmare of a 2 seed for some hosting team, probably an ACC team. If I had to guess, someone in the Carolinas, Florida State, maybe, we'll have to see, but regardless, playing a lot better these days. So yes, A&M series win does look better with the way Bama's playing right now. Armstrong says on YouTube, I'll put this on the screen again. I know they have different strengths, but this Kentucky team gives me 2022 Notre Dame vibes. Lack of big-time pro guys, but solid college players who can win. Agreed. Yes, agreed. Also, because that Notre Dame team had kind of a understated swagger about them. And by swagger, I don't necessarily mean they did a lot of, I think Kentucky does more chirping and all that kind of stuff than Notre Dame did, but they're not flashy, but they still have swagger. That Notre Dame team went into Knoxville and absolutely, in that super regional, absolutely thought they were going to win that series, and they did. Kentucky's probably going to be hosting in this if they get through to super regionals, because it looks like it's going to be a top 8 resume. But I don't think there's anybody they could play. You know, they just lost a series to Tennessee, but I guarantee you, whether they're right or not, those guys think, hey, we play that again, we win that series. Now, I like Tennessee's team better. I think it's a better team. I think it's a more well-rounded team. That may not be true, but certainly the parts of Tennessee's game they do better are significantly better than Kentucky. I like their offense significantly more, for example. But I think it's a good comp, Armstrong. I really do. Older guys too. Like, that's the other thing. It's just older. Not a lot of prospects, but guys who've been in college baseball forever, which will make next year. I mean, it's obviously we're putting the cart ahead of the horse, but next year is going to be an interesting transition for Kentucky, because they're going to have guys leave who have been there a long, long time, and they're going to have to kind of rebuild that roster. All right, let me catch up here. Arkansas versus Tennessee in a series, who you got on a neutral site. This is going to be a little bit, that says Nicholas Doherty on YouTube. Feel free to chime in if you have your own thoughts on this, but this is a little bit of a cop-out answer. I would almost exclusively make my decision based on what the neutral site park is, because if it's an offensive park, I'm taking Tennessee. If it's a park where you can pitch them a little bit, I'm probably going to take Arkansas. I just think Hagen Smith is such a differentiating factor in college baseball this year, with just a couple of exceptions. I mean, he is far and away the best starting pitcher, the most dominant starting pitcher in college baseball this year. It's a little bit like Paul Skeens last year, where Arkansas goes into every series basically feeling like they're up 1-0. That said, he does give up some home runs, not a ton, right? It's not like a problem, but when he gives up runs, it is often home runs. So if this is being played on a neutral site that plays small, I like Tennessee's chances, because I just don't think there's any way to stop Tennessee's offense when they're really rolling. I really don't. I still like their offense more than A&M's. A&M's a very good offense. That's not a slight against A&M. They're probably the second best offense in the country, but I think Tennessee's is the best in the country. I think Arkansas's pitching staff is the best in the country. So from our mouths to God's ears, I hope we get this matchup in Omaha. Obviously, it's not going to be able to happen before Omaha, because those are both going to be top 8 teams. So hopefully we get it in Omaha and we get to see that play out on the field. Oh, by the way, Omaha, bigger stadium. We've seen teams kind of struggle with that in the past. Wake Forest last year. Obviously, Wake Forest got really far in the tournament, but the offense was a little stuck in neutral. So we'll see how those teams adapt once we get to Omaha here. Ace Man on YouTube says A&M beat that Notre Dame team in Omaha, so I'm okay with it. Yeah, fair enough. C. Lee on YouTube. I wonder if this is my friend Chris Lee, who I've met before, does a good job covering Vandy. I will let him stay under the shroud of anonymity. What effect do you think – sorry, the comments were moving. What effect do you think Vandy having a starting pitcher suspended will have on the series versus Mississippi State? I think it's less about – so the pitcher is J.D. Thompson, suspended because he was ejected last weekend due to having a foreign substance on his person. His argument is that it was sunblock and rosin, which is fine, except for the fact that the rule doesn't really differentiate on what the substance is. You just can't have a substance somewhere else. You have to take the rosin from the bag and then toss the bag. You can't, do the arm thing and then rub on your arm. So whether or not it was meant to be a sticky substance, it just doesn't matter what the substance is. It was a substance, right? So that's that. Now, so I think it's less about having J.D. Thompson this weekend or not. I think he's a nice pitcher. I think it couldn't hurt to have him, but I think it's just more about the knock-on effects of the depth, right? So, Vanderbilt's going to have to pull someone else in to start. So maybe it's Grayson Carter, whoever it is, that person has to start. So now you're one arm short in the bullpen, and whoever you pull into the bullpen is probably not going to be stretched out to the extent that JD Thompson was. So you're going to be on a shorter leash with that reliever. So it's entirely likely that day becomes a staff day, unless it is Grayson Carter and he just shoves it, because he is capable of doing that. We just haven't seen it very often. So I think it's more of a depth concern than it is a JD Thompson shutting down Mississippi State concern. So ultimately, I really do think it more comes down to, can Vanderbilt play as well as at home as it has, and can it get the type of pitching from everybody else that they often need to get to win series? Because if this turns into a slugfest, you give Mississippi State a little more of a chance. All right. Jerry Blackford on YouTube says, I'll take 234 with our pitching. I suppose it's a reference to the batting average, relatively low batting average for Arkansas with their level of pitching. I agree. Like I think, and Aaron Fitt made this point on one of the earlier podcasts this week, that like you have to have high-end pitching to win a national title in this version of college baseball, with the College World Series being played where it is. Now, you can hit balls out of a TD Ameritrade or Charles Schwab Field. You can hit balls out of Charles Schwab Field in Omaha now. This is not 2014. However, you look at last year with LSU, they flatly don't win that national title if they don't get an absolute gem from Ty Floyd. They don't get what they got from Riley Cooper in relief, and they don't get that kind of spot start from Nate Ackenhausen. So all the offensive stuff is great. You have to have that too. You've got to be able to score runs. You're also not going to win games 2-1, but you do have to have somebody who can, keep the opposition off the scoreboard long enough to allow your offense to get the 4, 5, 6, 7 runs that typically wins you the game in Omaha. All right, I think I have combed through all these comments here, so let's finish up quickly. The series of the weekend for me is Mississippi State and Vanderbilt that we talked about a little bit. This is a separation series, both teams 10-8, both teams harboring hopes of hosting. Winning this series will send one team. One team's going to come out of here at least 12-9 in conference play, feeling a lot better about their hosting hopes. Vanderbilt's in a better position in terms of RPI. That's the other thing about State. Some of those midweek losses are still kind of hurting them in RPI, or early season losses are hurting them in RPI. So they've got some work to do, even if they win this series, of making sure that RPI gets into range. If they win enough SEC games, I'm going to bet the RPI follows, but it's not a guarantee, the way Vanderbilt with a top 20 RPI is already basically in position if they win enough SEC games. The pitching matchup of the day is also from that series. We have Cal Steven against Bryce Cunningham. Cal Steven has been so good in conference play, a 1.98 ERA for Cal Steven in SEC play. He's been just a rock for Mississippi State in their rotation. Bryce Cunningham, we know what the high-end ability there. When he's good, he can be really good. Consistency is sometimes a bit of a concern, but he's been perfectly solid. He has taken a step forward this season, given Vanderbilt what they needed in the rotation. That has a chance to be a really good pitching matchup there. I'll also throw a mention here for Georgia's Leighton Finley against Texas A&M's Ryan Prager. Prager, we know what to expect there, even with a tough matchup against a good Georgia lineup. Leighton Finley's been the steadiest starter for Georgia in a season when they haven't had a ton of steady starters. We've yet to kind of see him be a guy who can control a game, though. Now, A&M on the road is not really a great place to say, like, hey, go out there and really shove it past him and give us 6 or 7 shutout. That's not what I'm saying, but how well can Leighton Finley keep Georgia in the ball game when you know how powerful that A&M offense is? And then a note here as I get out, make sure you're following Mark Etheridge this weekend. He's going to do a few stops this weekend. I am home this weekend, but Mark is out on the road. He'll be at Georgia A&M tonight. Tomorrow he's actually taking in a Sun Belt game, and I suspect we have some, just given the geographic overlap, I suppose I'm sure we probably have some Southern Miss or UL Raging Cajun fans in this video here. On Saturday, he will be at Southern Miss UL, big series in the Sun Belt. And then on Sunday, he will be at Auburn LSU, of course, pending game time, weather, all of that kind of stuff. He's planning to be at Auburn LSU on Sunday before he heads back home. So make sure you're following along with Mark Etheridge. One more comment here, because I'm glad someone mentioned it, because I forgot to mention it. Ace Man on YouTube says, very windy this weekend in College Station. Ballpark will play small. That is true. I did hear about that. Going to be a windy weekend in College Station, talking about gusts like 20 some odd, 30 some odd, maybe 40 miles an hour. So yeah, not only does that mean the ball could fly out, it also means every high pop is going to be an absolute adventure. Could be an offensive weekend in College Station. I think honestly, both teams will be okay with that because that's kind of how both teams prefer to play their games. So we will obviously see how that turns out. All right, folks, that's it for me today. Thanks for joining. Thanks for kicking off the SEC baseball weekend with me. And thanks generally for supporting the show. When I started this at the beginning of the season, I honestly didn't know how it was going to go or what it was even going to look like. And we've kind of, along the way, we've figured it out, right, as time has gone on. But the interaction with you guys in the comments has been my favorite part of this. So I appreciate you keeping those coming. Make sure you're back tomorrow and Sunday for the Saturday and Sunday editions of Weekend Waypoints. I will talk to y'all then. Have a good one.